Hello, everyone, and welcome to True Colors, a show I love to do about true crime and my artwork, which is coloring based. If this is your first time here, welcome in. We're so glad to have you here. If you're just returning for the newest episode, thank you so much for being here. We love to see you every time. And today we're going to talk about the case of the 1976 school bus kidnapping. Now, the setting is in California, Chowchilla, California, to be exact, and the date is July 15th, 1976. At Dairyland Elementary School, on the day just before the last day of summer school, 26 children ranging in ages from 5 to 14 boarded a school bus, and it was sent to take them home. It was driven by a bus driver, Edward Ray. He went by Ed, though, but his real name was Frank Edward Ray. Now, Frank Edward Ray, or Ed, as we'll call him throughout the episode, started out his career as a farmer, but somewhere along the line decided to become a school bus driver since he truly loved children. And he was one of those school bus drivers that the children would always remember. You know, the ones. Everybody had one of these. The really, really nice bus driver that you always hoped you would get as your driver on your bus. I know I personally had one. His name was Alan. He was a superstar, and he always made me so comfortable and safe whenever he was the driver. It was great. According to CNN News, the children absolutely loved their summer school, so much so that they had all actually signed a petition that year to have it extended for another 2 weeks the next year. And they all were stated that it felt more like a summer camp than a summer school. Like, half of the day they would do their schooling and their learning, and the other half of the day it would be fun activities. Chowchilla is a very small town, especially it was back in 1976. And so there wasn't really a whole lot to do there. So for actually having something to do, the parents would elect to send their children to summer school. And the children really, really just enjoyed it. So now we're going to move on to a little bit further in this story. And the school bus is driving the children home. And in order to do this, they had to drive down a lot of rural roads. Well, they were driving down a rural road when the bus came across a white van that was blocking the road. And Ed, the bus driver, he had to do some real magic to get the big bus to get around the van without going off the road. And as he started to pass it, Ed noticed that the hood of the van was up as if somebody had been working on it. And Ed, being the nice person that he was, he leaned his head out the window of the bus and just kind of hollered, "Hey, does anybody need any help? Can I help you with something? You look like you're in a little bit of trouble there." Well, as at the very moment that Ed offered help, 3 men with pantyhose on their heads, and it was like the pantyhose, the long ones that go all the way up the legs. They had long dangly leg pieces that were hanging on each side of their head. So it was these guys with pantyhose on their head that kind of looked like bunny rabbits because they had long ears. But they all jumped on the bus, and they each had sawed-off shotguns in their hands. Now, they pointed the shotguns at both Ed and all of the kids. And these 3 men were 24-year-old Fred Woods, 24-year-old James Schoenfeld, and his younger brother, 22-year-old Richard Schoenfeld. Now, all 3 of these men came from richer families, and Fred himself even had a trust fund of over $100 million. So it's kind of curious, what is the motive behind them doing this? Because at this point, you would think money wasn't the motive. But that's a side note. That's just keep that in mind. Something to think about. Why on earth would somebody kidnap these kids? So these men demanded that Ed go to the back of the bus, and they were screaming order at the kids, and the kids were upset, and they were crying, and they were making a lot of noise. And Ed was just trying his hardest to keep the kids calm, and he was unsarcastically giving them orders, because I guess he would joke with them and kind of make sarcastic comments. But you get back in your seat, joking with them. But this time he was giving them orders, and he sounded very stern and very serious. And the kids found this very strange because it was very out of character for Ed. But they would go on to say later in life that while at the time it felt really weird to hear him speaking like that in such a stern tone, they understood that he was just trying to keep them safe, because the calmer and quieter the kids were, the better their chances of survival were. Because when it comes to men pointing guns at you, you never really know what's going to set them off to that point where something bad happens. So when it came down to it, they had one of the men that was pointing their shotgun at the children and Ed, while one of the other men was driving the school bus, and then the third man was driving directly behind the school bus, and they were driving through a bamboo field. So the kids would later go on to say in interviews that it was very, very bumpy, and it was bouncing them all around. And the youngest child, who was a girl named Monica, she was, remember, just 5 years old, didn't really seem to understand what was going on and wanted to know if the men that were pointing the guns at everyone were the Easter Bunny. And again, that goes back to the way they were wearing the pantyhose, how it looked like they had long ears. Shortly through the bamboo field, the bus came to a stop. And you could see that there was another van there waiting in the field. And so what they did was they forced half of the children into one van, and then Ed and the remainder of the children into another. And what they did is they backed the van up to the back of the bus where the emergency exit door would open. And they had the children and Ed jump from the bus into the van, so that way they weren't leaving any footprints, and that way all you could see is that tire tracks were there. So it was something that was clearly very planned out, way ahead of time. Now, the vans themselves, inside it was wood paneled vans, and all of the windows were blacked out, so you couldn't actually see inside. And that alone is anxiety giving. I can't imagine the type of darkness there was inside those vans. And it was very hot, and it was extremely dark. Larry Park told CBS News, quote, "As a 6-year-old, the only way I could describe the darkness in the van is that it was coming to get me." I mean, you wouldn't be able to see 2 inches in front of your face. The kidnappers drove the children in darkness in the van in 100-degree weather for 11 hours. Now, bear in mind, during this 11 hours, there was no food, there was no water, there was no bathroom breaks. It was just 11 hours straight, no stops. Meanwhile, during the drive, Ed was doing his best to try and keep the children as calm as possible in the van that he was in. And he was assuring them that it would be okay, everything would be all right, even though he wasn't sure what was going to happen. The children were dehydrated, they were getting sick, they were vomiting. I'm positive that there were some that must have urinated in their pants due to just the fact that 11 hours for a long time for anyone, much less a child. And I know adults that could not hold their bladder for that long, those poor children. And I can't imagine the humiliation they must have felt having to deal with that. It's traumatizing. It's truly traumatizing. The older children also stepped up and started doing their best trying to help the younger kids as much as they could. And Michael, the one that was 14 years old, he was in a separate van from Ed, and he was doing his best to kind of cheer up the younger children and keep them as calm as possible. Ed was also trying to keep the children calm by singing songs to them, songs like Boogie Nights or If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands. But apparently they changed some of the lyrics to If You're Sad and You Know It, Clap Your Hands, because let's be real, in that kind of a situation, you're definitely not going to be happy. And I think he was just trying to, also let them know that he related to them, that he understood this was not a fun, happy situation. And relating and empathizing with children is so important for validating their feelings. After nearly 12 hours in the van, they said it felt like the van went from driving on the road to being off-road again, as it got really bumpy and they were jumping around a lot. And they drove a bit more of a ways before the van stopped. Now, after the van stopped, the kidnappers would open the door and take Ed out and then shut the door, leaving only the children inside by themselves. And then eventually it would happen again and again. The kidnappers would open the door, they would grab the nearest child, and they would shut the door. And they just kept repeating this process. And the children inside were really becoming more terrified now, because they thought, once they were taking these children out, they were, killing them one by one. But what was really happening when they were getting taken out of the van is one man would ask what their age was, another man would ask what their name was, and the third man would ask them for their address. They would also take a piece of clothing from each child. Michael Marshall, which again was the oldest child, said that the kids in the van would just sort of cling to him, and he tried his best to keep them calm and keep them soothed, singing songs to them as well. And the youngest girl, Monica, was in there with Michael, and she was clinging to him for dear life, he said. Now, it eventually came down to just Monica and Michael when one of the men opened up the doors, and he went to reach for Monica, and instead of allowing this guy to take Monica, Michael said he just couldn't bear for them to take her, so he pushed her behind him and went ahead of her, thinking that he was pushing his way in front of her into his own death. He told CBS News, quote, "I had to take her hand from mine and rip and tear them apart and say it would be okay and then leave her, and that was so hard." I can't even imagine how that had to have felt, but what a hero, putting himself before the needs of others, putting himself in the path of potential death for that one girl. I mean, at 14, that's something amazing, truly. Now, the kidnappers had planned for this months in advance and had buried a moving van in a ditch in a California rock quarry. And they had moved Ed and each kid from the van from the vans they transported them in down into the moving van that they had buried. And in the moving van, they had put mattresses, water, bread, peanut butter, and cereal, but they only left enough food in there for one meal. They also had cut holes into boxes to make makeshift toilets, and they ended up putting Ed and all 26 children inside of this small moving van that was buried in the rock quarry. And then they pulled up the ladder and they said, we'll come back for you. But before leaving, they placed a manhole cover over the entrance that they had used to put Ed and the children in. And then on top of the manhole cover, they placed 2 truck batteries so that it would be, according to them, impossible to move. So that it would make it harder for these people to try and get out. And they then buried the top of the van, making it to where the children and Ed were buried under anywhere from 6 to 12 feet of dirt. And Ed and all of the kids reported that when they heard the sound of the dirt being moved around, they felt like they were being buried alive. And who could blame them? I mean, that would be the first thing on my mind as well. Now, eventually, after not hearing anything from the bus driver, the bus, or receiving their kids, parents began to really worry. So they started calling the school and talking to the school supervisor, who said, well, I understand your concern. The bus must have broken down. We will send another bus out there to go find where on the route Ed is with the kids, so that way we can pick them up and we can bring them to you, and it should be resolved quickly and you should see your kids in no time. However, after another bit of time, and the parents being in a small town were all in contact with each other, and calls being made, and still no one had gotten their children from the school bus, they called back and they said that the other bus was running the route and had yet to find where the bus broke down, but it should be resolved in a short time. It shouldn't be an issue. Their kids will be home soon. Parents weren't buying it. So the parents began to call the police with their concerns. Shortly after the police were involved, it wasn't long, and the FBI became involved as well. And it was a short time before they actually found the bus, and they found it by an air search. Because from just driving by or, trying to find it on the ground, it was just too well hidden in the bamboo for them to be able to see it. But they did find it with the air search, and they began their investigation. So they found the bus, of course, and they didn't see really any feet print. They saw one single footprint, and it was definitely not child size, which they found super concerning. But they did see that the tire tracks showed that somebody had pulled away in another vehicle. So it was clear that this was an obvious kidnapping case. And they began combing the bus for any kind of clues, but they weren't really finding anything. But they would continue to search. Now, while they were searching, this is what happened. The children and Ed were stuck in that hole for somewhere around 12 hours. So while with the almost 12-hour drive and being stuck in this hole, it's been almost 24 hours since the children and Ed were first kidnapped. Now, you have to think that with those tiny boxes and that many kids, those boxes that they had cut holes in for bathrooms began to fill up very quickly because of the dehydration and the anxiety and fear that the children were feeling. They were getting sick and vomiting, so it smelled like urine, it smelled like feces, it smelled like vomits. they had already gone through the food because, again, there was only enough for one meal. So they were hungry, they were thirsty, they were dehydrated. And a lot of the kids were starting to get hysterical, and a lot of them were crying for their parents. Michael would go on to say that it would get quiet for a short period of time, and then one kid would start crying, and then with the one kid crying, all of the kids would start crying, and it would get really loud again with the crying. And it was no surprise at all that things were horrific in there. Now, as far as oxygen would go, the kidnappers had put in a makeshift ventilation system that was comprised of some fans. They were battery-operated fans, and it wasn't a long time before the fans' batteries did die. So now it went from, the fear of being buried alive to they were quite literally starting to run out of oxygen due to the fact that there was no clean air being ventilated into this small moving van. And as this was happening, the roof of the truck slowly began to cave in under the pressure and weight of all the dirt that the kidnappers had put on top of it. The children would say that they could hear creaking and it was making a lot of noise, and that pieces of dirt were constantly falling in on them. Jennifer, one of the children, told CBS News that once that started happening, everyone kind of went into full panic mode, and she was quoted saying, We thought and they said, the older kids and Ed, if we're going to die, we are going to die trying to get out of here. And so that's what they did, try and get out. Ed, Michael, and a couple of the other older boys took the mattresses and stacked them up by the hole that they had come down in and began trying to move the manhole cover. But at first, they were unable to get it to move at all. Michael said that the children down below, all of the other kids, began cheering him on and trying to help however they could by giving him encouraging words. They tried for hours and hours to get this manhole cover to move, but they weren't getting very far with it. They were hot, they were sweaty, they were still dehydrated, they were probably breathing heavy because the oxygen wasn't great in there, and they were just about ready to give up when one of the boys from below shouted, it's moving, I see it moving. So they kept going, and together they were all able to get the manhole cover to move. So now Michael was ready to climb through the hole and kind of see what was going on, and he tentatively climbed into the first area outside of the manhole. And what the kidnappers had done is they had erected a wooden box that they had placed around the exit, and Michael did squeeze through the hole out into the box to kind of get an idea of what was going on. But what Michael found outside of that box was more dirt. So not only were they going to have to try and work to get everyone out this teeny tiny hole, they were going to have to dig their way out. And dig they did indeed. That's a hard sentence. Say that 5 times fast. But they did dig themselves out. It took them a couple of hours to get the dirt moved, but they were able to get the dirt moved, and they finally found sunlight. So now the thought about it is, we found sunlight, we found the way out. What are we going to find when we get on the other side of this box? Are they going to be out there waiting for us? Are we going to be able to find our way home? How are we going to find help? Is there going to be people around? But eventually they decided to go for it and get everyone out. So one at a time, they hoisted kids up through the hole and outside, and they got Ed and everyone else out of the hole, out of the moving box, and into the real world again. Now, we're going to take a step away from that and talk about what was happening outside while the world was looking for these kids, while the parents wanted to know what was going on, what was happening with the kidnappers and the parents. Now, the kidnappers, they didn't stick around the moving van. They went to their home and they immediately tried contacting police. But for some odd reason, they were only getting a busy signal. Their plan was to call the police department and demand $5 million for the return of the children. But every time they tried to call, all of the lines were jammed by the families of the children and the media calling nonstop for updates. So they kind of just gave that up and went and took a nap. Meanwhile, the police were still on the hunt for any clues as to where the children and that were on the bus could be. So let's go back to the children and find out what was happening while the police department and the families were looking for the children. Now, they got out of the hole into the rock quarry, and they began walking around together trying to look for anyone that can offer them some kind of help. And I'm sure they were scared because you never know if you're going to run into the people that kidnapped you. You don't know. But they did find a man. It was one of the security guards at the rock quarry, and the man saw them all coming out from this area, and he instantly knew what was going on. And they walked up to the man, and before the children or Ed could say anything, the man turns around and he looks at them and he says, "The whole world has been looking for you." And if that's not a movie line quote, it should be. They were in Livermore, California, more than 100 miles from Chowchilla, where they were taken from. So the guy that found them, the security guard, contacted the police, and Ed led the kids to the police so that the police could take them and take them somewhere safe. So they herded all of Ed and all of the children to the safest place they knew of, which actually just so happened to be the local jail. And I guess that while they were pulling up to the police station, one of the kids looked at the police officer and just said to him, "Why are we being taken to jail?" Which, after that experience, I can't blame the kid for being confused. All of the children were photographed and checked over by doctors and interviewed and were all relatively unharmed. There was some dehydration, there was some minor scrapes and bumps, but most of their injuries were psychological. They were all given soda pop and apples and at the police station, and then they were given the okay to go home with their families. Larry, who was a 6-year-old at the time, said that he just went up to his mom, who picked him up and said, and he just said to his mom, "Hi, Mom," and then fell asleep, which, that poor baby, I would be sleeping as soon as I found my mom too, because that would be the first moment that I felt safe in that whole ordeal. From the time that I got on that school bus to the time that I got to my mom's arms, that would be the first time that I felt safe. So obviously none of the kids could really give a great detailed description of what the suspects looked like because they did have those pantyhose on. So what the police did was they decided to go back to the moving van and do a full forensic search for any kind of clues, and it wasn't long before they found what they needed. And the first clue was who would have access to the key to get into the quarry at that time, and that would be Mr. Fred Woods. Fred Woods was the son of the owner of the quarry, so right away he became the prime suspect. And some of the other clues led them to the other two kidnappers, James and Richard Schoenfeld. So 2 years before the kidnapping, the three friends, James and Fred and Richard, had all been arrested together for grand theft auto, so they were already entered in a system database saying that they had known connections to each other. With this information, they were able to acquire a search warrant for Fred's house, and they did execute that. And in the execution of the search warrant, they did find one of the shotguns that was used in the kidnapping. So they were 100% able to connect Fred with the kidnapping. But they also found a document titled Plan. And this document detailed the entire kidnapping along with a ransom note. So they had been planning this kidnapping for over a full year. And while we don't really want to admit to this, they really were very well organized. They were able to gather also a few witnesses that were able to state that they had noticed the digging in the rock quarry prior to the kidnapping, and they had buried that moving van about a month in advance of the kidnapping. Richard, who had turned himself in, the youngest of the kidnappers, really seemed to just be along for the ride. He was the one who showed the most remorse. He acknowledged that what he had done was bad, and he seemed to really be the only one that truly understand how what they did traumatized the children and how horrible and awful it actually was. James and Fred, they fled California. Fred went to Vancouver and was later caught by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, although it didn't take long. And James was caught just outside of California. And what they did was they put all three of the men in a video lineup and told them to say key phrases that the children had stated were used during the kidnapping. And the children were able to positively identify all three of the men. Now, all three of the men pled guilty to 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom and robbery, and they were all charged with 8 counts of bodily harm, but they refused to plead guilty to the bodily harm because that came with a mandatory life sentence. So those counts for the bodily harm did go to trial, and the children did testify at the trial, which I can't imagine the amount of courage that it would take as a child at that age. Imagine an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 14-year-old, hell, even a 5-year-old going on the stand to face their kidnappers at that age. It's traumatizing enough to have to deal with that situation, but then to go and turn around and have to relive and rehash the whole thing all over again would just renew and refresh that trauma in all of their minds. So kudos to them for having that strength. I can't imagine it. On February 17th, 1978, all three were charged with mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole as they were found guilty. Their lawyers, would appeal the charges of bodily harm because although the happenings were traumatic, they did not meet the criteria of bodily harm as defined by law. So the sentencing of life without the possibility of parole would be switched to life with the possibility of parole. Now, Richard was granted parole in June of 2012, which was 36 years after the initial incident. That's a long time, but I feel like even though he was just following along and he had regret for what he has done, I just don't know if 36 years is enough time. 3 years after that, in 2015, his brother James Schoenfeld would be paroled. And Fred would continue to stay in prison. Fred was deemed the ringleader of the group, and the sheriff at the time said that James and Richard were really kind of just the dumb people that followed along and just did whatever Fred said they would, and that Fred was the true psychopath. While in prison, he was really astute at breaking the rules, and he kept getting caught with porn and cell phones, which in prison is a really big no-no. He would also try and run his business from inside the prison, which is another no-no, because you're not supposed to be making any kind of gains while you're in prison. You're there to be rehabilitated. Now, James told the parole board just before he was paroled that the reason that they did this was because they were in debt from all of the stupid choices and decisions that they had made. During his statement, he was quoted as saying, "We needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay for them, and they don't fight back, and they're vulnerable, and they will mind you." I'm just going to leave a long pause there because, wow, what a train of thought. Yes, children are innocent, and children are precious, and children are vulnerable, which is all the more reason why you should leave them alone. The children would go on to suffer from nightmares, phobias of the dark, small spaces, and would have difficulty allowing even their own children to go anywhere. Larry Park, who was 6 years old at the time, actually would go on to meet all three of the men later in life so that he could forgive them. In this picture here, you'll see a picture of Larry and Richard smiling together. The children were also granted a long trip to Disneyland with Ed, and the California School Employees Association of Sacramento presented Ed with a citation for outstanding community service, quote, particularly to 26 precious Chowchilla school children. The award was presented to Ed by the governor of the state, and he got many more heroism rewards after that. And in my opinion, Ed earned every single one of them. He really worked hard, and he got those children home. Like, I can't even imagine. I don't know if I would have the strength to do that. I hope I would. I really do. Just 5 weeks after the kidnapping, the whole town created and celebrated Ed Ray and Children's Day, where Ed and the children were all on floats. The kids did have a lot of issues, of course, afterwards. Again, like I said, with many of them stating to have had PTSD and having to sleep with the lights on. And a lot of them later on in life had like substance abuse problems. But for the most part, they were able to finally get things straightened out and turn their life around, but stating that even still to this day, they have nightmares about the situation. A lot of the parents would say that for many years, life for them was having moments of hearing their kids screaming in the middle of the night and waking up and running into the room to comfort them and trying to help them as best as they could. Ed was hailed as a hero for the rest of his life, and was super humble about it. And his own kids said that Ed had just loved kids his whole life, and he got to really live and enjoy a lot of his life with his grandkids And it was a long life at that, as he passed away at 91 years old in May of 2012. His entire life, those kids were by his side, and they kept in contact with him and would visit him frequently. A lot of them were even by his side when he passed away. Family members said that Ed would collect newspaper clippings from the kidnapping, but that he wouldn't really talk about it, and he would just quietly put them away somewhere. And Ed even bought the school bus that was used in the kidnapping for $500 because he said he didn't want to see it go to the scrapyard, as he felt it was a very important thing because they had survived. His son said that he would keep it in the barn and he would go out and start it up from time to time. And he did keep it for many years, although at some point he did end up donating it to an old equipment museum where you can still go for a public viewing to this day in La Grande. A lot of kids came back to the bus after he passed away and wrote messages on the bus for him. As to the situation, Ed is quoted saying, "All I knew is that I had to protect these kids and make them feel all right. And even if they were dying that day, I wanted to think they were all right. And my main goal was to make sure that these kids made it home to their parents." And now, for the whole reason that I chose this case, indeed, there is a recent update. Fred Woods, who had his 18th parole hearing on March 25th of 2022 and was granted parole at age 70. The decision by the panel will become final within 120 days, and then the governor has 30 days to review the decision. Because it was not a murder conviction, the governor can either let it stand or send it to a full review board. So there is a possibility that I may have to do another update on this case later on down the road, but I would like to see what happens first. Because at the time that I wrote down the notes, it had not even been a full month since the decision had been made. But honestly, even at 70 years old, I don't believe this man should be gifted any kind of freedoms. I believe that prison is where he belongs. I believe that the scheming and planning that he came up with was for more than just money. I believe he truly, really enjoyed what he was doing. And that's wrong. And I don't like it one bit. But that's my humble opinion. And you're entitled to your own. If your opinion is different, if you think at 70 he should be set free, that's your prerogative. And I appreciate that you have your own opinion. Anyways, that's going to wrap up the end of this episode. And I appreciate you all for sticking with me through it. If you stuck all the way through here, that must mean that you truly enjoy my show. So you should definitely smash that subscribe button. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, and if you could, toss a girl a like. She would be so appreciative. And don't forget, you can watch me be bad at games at the link on the screen.